weather here to hear about the American approach. Well, thank you. It's great to be here at Davos House, USA with you all. Thank you for joining me, braving the cold weather here to hear about the American approach to international economic policy. I'm not talking about just what we're doing today. I'm talking about how the Americans have done it for centuries. And as you'll see as I go through today's speech, the default position for most of U.S. history has been a pragmatic one involving a mix of tariffs, state involvement, and trade agreements that optimize trade for the United States. President Trump has revived this approach with great effect. I'll also describe in detail how this approach has influenced the rest of the world throughout history. And of course, I'll provide my views on how all of this is relevant for today as we face challenges in the international economic system. And frankly, after reviewing all of this, you may all agree with me that the problems and solutions of the past actually look a lot like the problems and solutions of today. This talk may get a little dense as we walk through American history. May feel like you're a little bit back in college, so just stay with me. Luckily, I'm standing, so I won't fall asleep. If you do, I forgive you. But we should start at the beginning. On another cold day, on December 5th, 1791, America's first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, delivered something called the Report on Manufactures to Congress. In that report, Hamilton articulated a plan for the United States to shake off its economic dependency on the British Empire. In that report, Hamilton argued for a strong economic policy that would allow America to become an industrial power. He called for a combination of tariffs and subsidies to incentivize industrialization. Hamilton believed that such measures were necessary to promote the development of industries, like textiles at the time, that needed protection from dominant foreign producers to develop the scale that would allow them to supply U.S. needs and also be globally competitive. This vision, as I will discuss, laid the foundation for American and even global prosperity in the 19th and 20th centuries. Hamilton immediately shifted from words to action. He created something called the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures, and he founded the city of Paterson, New Jersey, to sustain this. It was a government-backed industrial organization, and it made large investments in textile infrastructure and soon blossomed into a massive and durable industry. This growth continued unabated for about 2 centuries, and by the 1890s, nearly half of all silk in the United States was processed in this tiny city of less than 9 square miles. Now, what's interesting is that the manufacturing ecosystem that emerged in Paterson made it a hub of activity far beyond textiles. New factories kept springing up in the city, making rail cars, pipelines, and weather balloons. A prototype submarine was developed in Paterson, New Jersey in the 19th century. And by the 20th century, Paterson had become an aerospace hub. The Curtiss-Wright Corporation turned out engines that powered aviation pioneers like Amelia Earhart, as well as the iconic B-17s and B-25s that helped achieve victory in World War II. But as the 20th century came to a close, the industrial might of Paterson began grinding to a halt. Other nations had learned Alexander Hamilton's lessons, while American leaders slowly forgot them. As the United States chose to favor more imports and mothball its original industrial policy toolkit, countries across Europe and Asia actually doubled down on that American toolkit. While American policymakers decided to abandon manufacturing and production to some degree, our trading partners pushed for dominance in sectors we failed to prioritize or even voluntarily let go. New Jersey lost almost 47% of its manufacturing jobs after 1994. In the period after the United States entered the World Trade Organization, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and granted China permanent normal trade relations. Paterson then became one of the poorest cities in the United States. So the project that Hamilton began and that lasted about 200 years was undone by a U.S. experiment in so-called free trade, one that tied America's hands behind its back while failing to address the practices of countries that had weaponized our own methods against us. So Paterson is a good example of what has gone right and what has gone wrong with American trade policy. So I want to walk you through more of our history so you can understand how America became an industrial power in the first place, how we lost our way, and our path back to a pragmatic trade policy. As I mentioned, Alexander Hamilton called for using tariffs and subsidies to develop America into an independent manufacturing power. Hamilton tragically died before his 50th birthday. There's like a musical you can watch if you want more information about that. But despite that, others continued to pursue his vision. There was a Kentucky senator named Henry Clay, and he took up Hamilton's cause. The economic dependency on the British Empire that concerned Alexander Hamilton continued to loom over the United States. Following the War of 1812, Clay convinced Congress that we needed to take bold action in order to reverse this dependency and allow the United States to develop into an industrial power in its own right. Over decades in Congress, he crafted consensus around what he called the American system. This program combined high tariffs and state support for industry with a belief in the power of a large internal free market. In other words, the US Constitution was our most important free trade agreement, and countries outside the Constitution were not entitled to those benefits of freedom of commerce. Trade between the states would be free and seamless, but access from other countries was carefully limited to encourage the development of a robust American industrial commons. Government helped build canals and railroads and promoted competition within the country. The formula worked. Towns like Paterson, New Jersey, thrived. By the time of the Civil War, the American system had built up the beginnings of the American industrial machine. American per capita industrial output increased 525% from 1750 to 1860, eclipsing all other major countries other than the UK. However, American ingenuity and productivity was held back by Southern slavery, which kept the country tied to an exploitative and backwards planter class that pushed ceaselessly for free trade. Southern millionaires wanted to sell the cotton that their slaves grew to the British and buy cheap foreign manufactured goods in return, and had no interest in supporting American industry or any idea of a broader American project. The South at that time apparently preferred a colonial model for its own economy, with the South playing the part of commodity-producing economy. So it should come as no surprise that President Abraham Lincoln was a strong proponent of tariffs. Or in President Lincoln's own words, "My politics are short and sweet, like the old woman's dance. I am in favor of a national bank, I'm in favor of the internal improvement system, and a high protective tariff." President Lincoln famously was among the first Republicans, and he set a policy for Republicans early on. President Lincoln had an influential advisor named Henry Carey. Has anyone heard of this guy? Seriously, who's heard of him? One person, two? Okay, two people, that's good. That's actually pretty good. When I saw Henry Carey, I thought of Harry Carey. He's like this announcer for the Cubs from years ago, but okay, there's like 4 people who got that. But Henry Carey, he did more than anyone, arguably even Hamilton, I think, in laying out the rationale for America's development agenda, as I'll discuss later, his global impact, and he inspired much of the world to copy it. He had 2 core arguments, and they're worth considering today. First, Carey argued that tariffs were essential to create what he called a harmony of interests. In his view, growth in the domestic market should create more and better jobs for regular people who then spend their newfound money on domestically produced goods, which then further grows the economy in a positive cycle. Carey argued that the resulting diversified economy would be more resilient and would actually grow faster by creating network effects across sectors and better tapping the diverse talents of entrepreneurs and workers. It was not a policy to curtail consumption, but was designed to promote consumption of domestic goods produced by Americans. And second, Carey believed in the dignity of labor, and he was a passionate opponent of poverty and exploitation, and of course slavery. His work for the Union helped dismantle slavery, but Carey realized that American abolition was not enough. He argued that the United States needed tariffs to counteract the effects of abusive labor and other practices around the world. He attacked the colonialism of European empires like Britain, France, and Spain. He explained that the United States needed to protect its workers from having to compete against abusive regimes that did not value the dignity of the people that they ruled. And he argued that we had to have this to avoid a race to the bottom, echoing many themes we hear today. Of course, the Union won the Civil War, and they took Carey's advice. America raised its tariffs on the world, and economic development surged even faster. And by 1913, U.S. per capita, am I on the right one? Yeah, there we go. U.S. per capita industrial output was the greatest in the world, 10% greater than that of the UK, and 600% larger than it was in 1860. According to one study, American industrial production soared by over 1,000% between 1860 and 1910. However, this growth did come with a negative side effect. Industrial magnates worked to capture the gains for themselves at the expense of the nation and formed cartels and monopolies to better exploit both workers and consumers. Enter President Teddy Roosevelt, who was in office in the first decade of the 20th century, and he realized that American development could not continue to be successful without a return to robust competition. For tariffs and protection to drive investment, firms in the domestic market must feel competitive pressure to invest and not just to raise prices and capture rents. So President Roosevelt, he did something about it and went to war with the trusts. In the process, he created the foundation for the antitrust law that regulates our markets today. And at the same time, Roosevelt doubled down on protection and American industrial development. In another interesting quote from a Republican president on trade, Roosevelt once wrote that in this country, pernicious indulgence in the doctrine of free trade seems inevitably to produce fatty degeneration of the moral fiber. So he didn't mince words. As the Great Depression set in a couple decades later, Congress famously, or perhaps infamously, raised tariffs through the Smoot-Hawley bill. Although that law is the bane of many high school economics teachers, and again, I'm making these American media references. If you've ever seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, there's a very famous scene where they're talking about the Smoot-Hawley bill. But even so, most economists, including Barry Eichengreen and Paul Krugman, they've made the point that the tariffs, they did little to worsen the crisis. They could have had a slight expansionary effect. They didn't have an inflationary effect. All of that makes sense, as America had been maintaining high tariffs for a long time, for much of the previous century. Smoot-Hawley ended up raising the average tariff rate from 40 to 46%. Obviously, tariffs aren't a magic wand. They didn't reverse the Great Depression, but they didn't plunge it into something worse. I would also say at that time, the United States was a surplus nation. I think tariffs work better for a deficit nation. But in any event, this is why Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, he did not fundamentally change that tariff landscape when he implemented his New Deal program, even though he changed all kinds of other pillars of American society. The 1936 Democratic Party platform emphasized that FDR's administration would, this is the quote, continue, as in the past, to give adequate protection to our farmers and manufacturers against unfair competition or the dumping on our shores of commodities and goods produced abroad by cheap labor or subsidized by foreign governments. FDR also decided to pursue limited reciprocal trade deals. That might sound familiar to some of you, especially if anyone here has negotiated with me on our reciprocal trade deals we're doing these days. But under these New Deal era reciprocal trade agreements, the United States lowered tariffs for countries that removed what the Secretary of State Cordell Hull called discriminations and obstructions. But the United States continued to put restrictions on unfairly traded imports that threatened our workers and producers. This made good sense, especially from America's position of post-war industrial dominance and given the desire to rebuild the world's economies after the war. And then, through the middle of the 20th century, American presidents were not shy to take bold trade action when necessary. Lyndon Johnson imposed 25% tariffs on pickup trucks that we still have to this day. This was the result of a trade dispute with Europe about American chicken exports, a dispute that also remains with us to this day, 60 years later. President Nixon, he put a 10% global tariff on the world in 1971 in response to an emerging, but small by contemporary standards, trade deficit. And through it all, America pursued the industrial strategy that Hamilton had laid out more than 200 years ago. We protected our industry from foreign competition where that was necessary to unlock growth or to counteract unfair production conditions abroad. The American project was pragmatic, it was multifaceted, it combined the power of market competition with appropriate government policy action to encourage economic development. We leveraged the same playbook when we faced the challenge of a large trade deficit back in the 1980s due to non-market policies in a resurgent Japan. Through quotas on autos, tariffs on steel, currency adjustment, and innovative industrial policy programs like Semitech to promote semiconductor research, we reversed course and powered into the 1990s with an unrivaled industrial base and innovation engine. But at the end of the Cold War, as many reveled in what they thought was the end of history, American policymakers largely jettisoned our historic and pragmatic approach to trade. Or perhaps they grew complacent on the assumption of endless prosperity. We pursued hyperglobalization regardless of the consequences, and we bound our hands with NAFTA and the World Trade Organization in ways that made it impossible for the United States to effectively respond to foreign practices and defend our industrial production. Now, other countries, on the other hand, they never forgot the American playbook. They had shaped their economic systems to learn from the United States and were not foolish enough to stop when the US decided to pursue globalization as an end in itself. The American system had become, in some ways, a global economic system, shaping the structures of economies far beyond our borders. For example, in the middle of the 19th century, a German economist named Friedrich List, he read Hamilton's work. He was inspired by it. He developed a comprehensive and influential theory of economic development that spread the American system around the world. List emphasized the importance of strategic trade measures to cultivate what he called the aggregate productive powers of a country over time. This is a very realistic approach to national economics. Like Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay, List emphasized the need for tariffs to counteract the advantages enjoyed by powerful foreign firms, such as subsidies and entrenched economies of scale. And he also echoed the American call for robust domestic competition to promote productive investment. List's propagation of the American system had a potent effect on industrial development worldwide. Influenced by these ideas, Otto von Bismarck raised German tariffs in 1879, shortly after he unified Germany into one powerful country. The Germans who promoted this shift were explicitly influenced by Henry Carey and the American system. When he was speaking with industrialist Wilhelm von Kardorff, a prominent German advocate of Henry Carey's arguments, Bismarck, he actually apologized for his earlier support for free trade. Bismarck told Kardorff that, "Now I am a complete convert and want to make good my earlier errors." For better or for worse, Bismarck's experiment worked and set the model for Germany's rapid economic development. The American project also influenced trade and policy and economic policy in Japan. American ideas aligned well with the approach to economic development promoted by Meiji statements such as Okubo Toshimichi and intellectuals such as Fukuzawa Yukichi. The pioneering late 19th century finance minister, Matsukata Masayoshi, often invoked List and Hamilton when he successfully pushed for higher tariffs, a strong central bank, government support for industry, and the result was unprecedentedly fast state-backed industrialization in Japan, and it became one of the world's great manufacturing nations. So all of the economies of the world learned from the American example. Canada, their 1879 national policy significantly raised tariffs to promote Canadian industrial development. Much later, to address Canada's trade deficit, the 1965 US-Canada Auto Pact required US automakers to produce more cars in Canada. They didn't used to make cars there. In Australia, leaders in the state of Victoria cited Henry Carey and other American thinkers in promoting a series of tariff increases from the 1860s to 1890s. No coincidence that Victoria remains Australia's premier manufacturing state to this day. Sun Yat-sen, the Chinese nationalist, he emphasized developmentalist ideas such as trade protection, subsidies, state-backed financing that later inspired Deng Xiaoping and helped create the Chinese industrial juggernaut. And in Taiwan, science city clusters supported by the government provide the research, development, and manufacturing ecosystems for the world's greatest semiconductor manufacturing zone. So, wherever we dig into stories of successful economic development, we see Hamilton and his successors at work. That much is clear. So the question is, what got lost in the post-war global order? At the end of World War II, most countries, when you look at the history, assumed that Hamiltonian economic policy was the default among nations, and they planned around it. The negotiators at Bretton Woods and other economic conferences wrote new rules based on this and baked tariffs and trade measures into the post-war international economic order. That makes sense because all major nations had used tariffs and industrial policy to support their economic development. This was the world they lived in. The question for the international trading system, however, at that time, again, to quote Friedrich List, the German academic from 1837, was how can the common interests of the various nations best be served and how opposing interests could be reconciled? This was a particularly important question to a world still reeling from World War II. The Allies desired to create institutions to resolve economic conflicts amongst themselves while allowing different countries to pursue their own development agendas toward the goal of reconstruction. This was not an easy task. Solutions were not obvious. In retrospect, there are things we could and should have done differently, but that's the world they were facing. John Maynard Keynes, the British economist and the British representative to the Bretton Woods Conference, he had an idea for how this could be done. He argued that the international economic system needed to be organized around the principle of balanced trade. And that's what we talk about today. Nations could pursue what Keynes called national self-sufficiency through different models of economic development. But a requirement of long-term balanced trade would protect everyone against so-called beggar-thy-neighbor tactics. Keynes and his contemporaries like Joan Robinson argued that in most circumstances, a country's persistent global trade surplus is very strong evidence that it is pursuing economic growth at the expense of its trade partners. In other words, a country that is structurally exporting more than it is importing likely is harming the rest of the world just to fuel its own growth. It's not producing to meet its needs or to trade for import. It's trying to have a shortcut to growth at everyone else's expense. To put it even more clearly, a country should export in order to import. And if that's not happening, then it's a clear sign that something is wrong. Many of Keynes' most creative ideas for how to deal with this problem were left on the cutting room floor at Bretton Woods. He wanted a global currency, things like that. The system that emerged did not have a completely structural mechanism to discourage imbalances. And to be honest, the United States had a big trade surplus at the time, so maybe that had something to do with it. That being said, we are where we are today. But Keynes' arguments, they weren't completely lost. At the time, we drafted the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, in 1947. It actually included several rules that reflected Keynes' ideas, the ideas of balance, the use of tariffs, et cetera. And this text, the GATT text, is still the text underpinning the World Trade Organization agreements. And these ideas of Hamilton and Clay and Carey, you can read them, you can see them in the GATT. For example, Article 18, it's called Governmental Assistance to Economic Development. So this is an idea they incorporated. It explicitly states that it may be necessary in order to implement programs and policies of economic development designed to raise the general standard of living to take protective or other measures affecting imports. Now, the GATT would say that such tariffs could only be used by countries looking for a progressive development of their economies, but isn't that what everyone's looking for? These days, lawyers in Geneva will say that that section is only for self-declared developing nations, but I think every nation wants to be developing. The GATT also incorporated tools that countries can use to push back against imbalanced trade and its harmful effects. In Article 12, it says that countries that have a persistent trade deficit can impose tariffs to protect the balance of payments. This means that deficit countries can use tariffs to protect their citizens from harmful effects such as excessive debt or currency devaluation that would otherwise be transmitted to them by the policies of the persistent trade surplus nations. In other words, it stops countries from externalizing their own overproduction or lack of domestic demand to other countries. And then, of course, Article 6 really contains a reference to Henry Carey's arguments about protecting workers from bad practices abroad. That section says that countries can raise tariffs to respond to foreign subsidies or dumping. And all developed economies regularly use these tools to this day. And the list goes on and on. The international trade rules, as originally written after World War II, do not promote free trade as an end in itself. That's something that developed after World War II. They acknowledge, those rules acknowledge that countries use tariffs that they need to develop and that they need to intervene to protect their economies and protect against imbalances. The GATT rules were intended to be flexible. They allowed countries to use methods they needed to support their economy while trying to resolve conflicts that inevitably emerged. But these original goals and principles that we can see written into the GATT were rejected as the Cold War ended. With the WTO, we created a rigid dispute settlement system filled by unaccountable bureaucrats in Geneva, a couple of whom are here who work for the United States, so that you too. And they interpreted the rules so narrowly that they lost much of their intended flexibility. And oftentimes, the United States ended up changing our laws to accommodate what was found in Geneva, even though we had negotiated for something different at the bargaining table. And we allowed large non-market economies into the world trading system, gave them the same tariff treatment as we did to market economies, and we didn't hold them accountable to the commitments they made in the process. And at the same time, the United States unilaterally disarmed. We slashed our tariff rates below the rates of nearly all our trading partners. We opened our borders to unprecedented and nearly unlimited flows of foreign labor, capital, goods, and services. And meanwhile, other countries continued to use the tools that America had innovated, but they used them against us. And they were often hidden behind non-tariff barriers like unfair standards or regulatory restrictions based on what I think are fake concerns. Non-market economies use the full force of their state budget and regulatory apparatus to build massive export capacity disconnected from the market realities of profit, capital allocation and consumer demand. And the United States let them do it, and others did too. But that era is over. The United States is now moving forward to fix historic problems with historic solutions. As Americans take active steps to rebalance our own trade, our partners, of course, are free to join with us to build a new international economic system that's adapted to today's challenges. So this time around, we think that the goal of the international system should be to prioritize and protect national interests while also ensuring balance and fairness. We continue to benefit from a lot of rules across many areas, whether it's IP or services. We want to make sure that business has certainty, et cetera. But we can't allow our national interests to be boxed in by outdated frameworks that no longer serve their purpose, if they ever did. So we have to make sure that the new system builds in the flexibilities we need to address economic vulnerabilities, to prevent exposure to economic coercion, and to unlock productivity gains in our domestic markets. Most importantly, such a system must address structural imbalances head-on and make long-term balance a cornerstone of international economic policy. I think it's important for all of us, not just the United States. For us, right, we're the world's consumer of last resort, so we have to have a longer-term reset to higher average tariff rates, which we've already done. For other countries, it will require opening long-closed markets, shifting to greater domestic consumption, and reigning over capacity. And we're seeing some of that going forward, too. We're well along this path as President Trump has increased these tariff rates and made deals to open foreign markets. This approach, combined with sensible energy, tax, and regulatory policy, has resulted in increased GDP. It's reversed the trend in our trade deficit. It's boosted our wages, particularly for blue-collar workers. We're disrupting the status quo, not for its own sake, but because we need to fix this problem. We're taking action to protect American interests. The new system is emerging. It's in the interest of the American workers, producers, farmers, and ranchers. My guess is that people in Europe, the United Kingdom, and Mexico, and other economies are also vulnerable to non-market practices and overcapacity. More and more workers in those countries are seeing their own livelihoods disappear underneath them due to floods of cheap imports from abroad. So a balanced international economic order is in their interest as well. And if their politicians do not yet understand that they face the same pressures as America, their voters will probably let them know quite soon. I'm going to end up here. I think there are some questions. I hope I didn't use up all the time. But thank you for your attention, and hopefully now you can wake up. You can ask me the hard-hitting questions. Thanks.
Well, thank you for laying out the historic and arguments that are mainly economic arguments. I'd like to bring you to the present day, where the latest threat of tariffs is not based on an economic argument. The president is threatening to put tariffs on various countries in Europe because they are resisting what he wants, which is Greenland. Do you think that that is the right use of tariffs?
So I would say that that is an appropriate use of tariffs. So I have, as you noted, I've gone over the economic rationale for all of this. In the United States, other countries as well, there's a long history of using tools that are at the nexus of economics and national security. In the United States, we have export controls, we have sanctions, we have prohibitions, we have things we do with SWIFT, things we do in conjunction with Europeans, things we do on our own. Sometimes countries agree with us, sometimes they don't. And so this falls into that category, right? This falls into, the president clearly has decided he doesn't want to impose full sanctions on countries all the time, but he can use a lesser measure like tariffs to try to also set the scene for whether it's negotiations or other geopolitical outcomes.
You think that what the president is doing is setting the scene for negotiations?
That's possible. It's something he's talked about. I think he's very clear on what he expects on that front. I'm not going to get ahead of him by any means. All I can say is the president has used tariffs, this term, for when countries have refused to take back illegal immigrants that came to the United States and committed crimes. Countries refused to take them back. For that instance, he's used them in other situations where countries are buying Russian oil, right? So there are a variety of geopolitical instances Again, there's a long history of the US or other countries using tools that intersect with economics and national security, and this is one of those instances.
I'm wondering whether that makes your life a bit more complicated.
Oh, no,
because,
no, not at all.
Because you spent all of last year negotiating trade deals. So the EU trade deal, for example, may not go through. It is now suspended, essentially. The EU is threatening to retaliate with tariffs as well, and you could get into this escalatory situation where everything that you have worked on will no longer apply.
Well, let me make a couple points. First of all, Europe has done nothing to implement the trade deal. Nothing. So it's actually, for the EU to say, well, we're suspending it, what are they suspending? Their continued negotiations with us.
Well, it hasn't been ratified.
For example, when we made the trade deal with the Europeans, shortly thereafter, we modified our tariffs to be much lower. We cut them a deal on autos that other people don't have. We cut them a deal on other products other people don't have. The Europeans have not lowered a single tariff for us. They have their process. I understand they have their process. Yeah. My point is, it actually doesn't change the status quo of outcomes, which is what we're focused on. Now, does it complicate negotiations? The Europeans have said that it does, so I trust them. They know their situation better than I do. I'm always open to having silos and compartmentalizing. I understand the Europeans feel differently. I've had communications with our counterparts. I'll see Maroš Šefčovič this week. We'll have further discussions. Listen, I operate in the real world, right? I know the kind of effect this has had on the European view of the United States and the trade agreement. If the Europeans have decided that they're going to loop the trade agreement into Greenland, and they'll come back and say, well, no, you looped the trade agreement into this. The reality is, if you look at the trade agreement as drafted, the joint statement, it doesn't solve every problem, nor was it intended to. There are things that are not addressed in the trade agreement. It doesn't fix all of the agricultural issues we have with Europe. Some of them it does. It doesn't fix the regulatory issues, which are hugely problematic. It doesn't fix pharmaceutical price. There are all kinds of things it doesn't fix. And so the idea that somehow this was a comprehensive trade agreement, that was never the idea. So we can have different things going on at the same time, and I think we have to.
So let's just look at this from their perspective for a sec. If there is a trade agreement between two countries, then, and tariffs can be imposed for other purposes, then what is the value of this trade agreement? I mean, don't you worry that the negotiations that you are conducting, even if you sign agreements, what is the worthiness of these agreements if you can have tariffs beyond the agreements?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you have a trade agreement, and if something happens outside the bounds of that trade agreement, like this, countries have a decision to make, and they're going to base it on their domestic politics, on what they think they need to do. And part of what I've been discussing this whole time is that trade should be focused on national interests, and that we shouldn't be bound to agreements that tie our hands. And so if the Europeans have decided, we're not going to be bound to this, we think it ties our hands, we're going to do something else, that's a European choice. I don't agree with them, right? I think we can compartmentalize. If they feel differently, then that's their national interest, fine, but then they enter into a world where the escalation you're talking about can happen, right? Listen, I'm a realist. I live in a realist world. If the Europeans decide to roll everything together into a trade agreement that by its terms was limited to some of the most important issues, that's a sovereign decision for them.
So what you believe in, you mentioned the word compartmentalize. So you think that you can have these agreements, and then if something happens beyond that, then you have to address it completely differently.
Well, I think you
That's
can.
a completely different basis.
I mean, listen, things have always happened. Take the Japanese, for example, okay? We've always had great relations with the Japanese. We've had a good security relationship. But in the 80s, we had a trade war with the Japanese, right? And we ended up taking strong trade measures. But they were really compartmentalized, and so were we. I'm not saying it's easy, and again, I'm being realistic. I'm not pretending that it's easy for the Europeans to do this. It's clearly not. But there is a history of doing this. When we have a trade dispute at the WTO or something, that's an isolated dispute. When we do anti-dumping countervailing duties, that's an isolated dispute. I mean, it is part and parcel of trade. I mean, it gets this idea, there's this suggestion that somehow we can get to a spot where everything is perfect and working, and it's just not. There are always going to be issues. you should negotiate deals that address the issues as best as they can. That's what you should do. And then you have other issues that happen. You have to deal with them as they come. I mean, until we get to the point where Europe has eliminated all of its digital trade issues, India's taken all its tariffs down, China stops subsidizing, then maybe we can all hold hands and sing the song of globalization together. But until then, we're going to have deals, we'll have setbacks, we'll go forward 2 steps. I mean, it's just the reality of the world we live in.
What's interesting to me is that the US has sort of moved on to this new reality, but you are in the driving seat, and so you can drive that reality. And others who are, at the receiving end find it a lot more difficult to keep up or to find a strategy to deal with it. For them, this is just chaos.
Well, for us, we're catching up for years where we allowed extremely non-reciprocal relationships. For us, our actions on the trade side are largely defensive. We have this massive trade deficit, which you'll have some people say trade deficits don't matter. And I guess if you're a multinational corporation, they probably don't matter to you because you're making money on either side of the border. What do you care? But if you're like an auto worker in Ohio or you're a HVAC equipment manufacturer in Michigan, deficits matter to you because it represents a consumption, production that could have been produced in the United States for consumption there. So it matters. And I would say that for us, as we try to rectify this deficit that's been going on for some time and really exploded by 40% in the last 5 years, these are defensive measures. I mean, that's why I kind of went through the history so everyone can understand we've had deficits before and we've taken action before. We've had imbalances before, we've taken action before. There are times when we've been the ones with the surplus and countries have taken action.
So you've talked in the past about the need to secure supply chains, and we saw China choking off the supply of several rare earths earlier this year. Does their control of this supply chain limit how you approach China? Because this is an ongoing negotiation.
Well, I think it makes us realistic about it. Even in a world where we weren't dependent on China for its supply chain, President Trump would want to have a constructive economic relationship with them. Certainly. I will say that when the Chinese come in and say, we're going to control the world's supply chain for rare earth minerals, you have to have a conversation with the Chinese about why that's the case and what can be done to have that flow coming, right? And you know that we did a deal where we lowered our tariffs a little bit. They're still subject to about an average 45 or 35% tariff, somewhere thereabouts. So does it limit it? I don't know if that's how I would say it. We want to have a good relationship with the Chinese. It complicates it, right? I mean, we know that if they want to escalate, they can escalate. We could escalate too if we wanted. We have all kinds of things that the Chinese need. It's not really in the interest of the United States to escalate to have a giant trade war to cut off that can result in cutting off rare earths, nor us cutting off things we sell into China.
You seem to often in the behavior of the administration to think that China is so powerful that you really need to manage this relationship. But when it comes to Europe, you're a lot more, you're more willing to push Europe. Is it because you see Europe as being much weaker than China? Because Europe is your ally.
So I think the premise is just wrong because we have much higher tariffs on China. A lot of their investment doesn't come into the United States. We export control a lot of things. So, I mean, it's just to suggest that we're treating Europe more poorly than China is just out of line with the facts. I mean, we have been, since 2018, we've had very substantial tariffs on China. There have been export controls on China that they hate. There has been investment scrutiny that the Congress of the United States has stepped up. I mean, it's just, these are just things of a totally different nature. I think for the United States, well, let me make one more point. Our trade deficit with the EU this year might end up, or for 2025, might end up being bigger than our trade deficit with China. We reduced that trade deficit with China by about 25% last year. So when it comes to imbalance, we have a huge imbalance with Europe. You've had huge access into the US market for many years. We've had limited access into Europe. You limit our agricultural imports, you limit our industrial imports, and you have a huge surplus with us. And it's not because Europe is particularly competitive. I know I'm here in Europe, and I've spent a lot of time in Europe. I have children born here. I like Europe. But the reality is you're not competitive. Most of us here have read the Draghi report. We know you have bad energy policy. The fact that you have this massive surplus with the United States can't be due to competitiveness.
You look this year at China's trade surplus, which keeps going up. Definitely, it's lower with the U.S. But China, by putting a lot of pressure on China, China is actually expanding elsewhere. And surely you do care about the economic influence of China.
Well, first and foremost, we worry about the American economy. And so we've taken measures to protect against overcapacity. Certainly from China, they're the biggest offender, but there are other Asian economies, Vietnam, elsewhere, who have a lot of overcapacity. They have high tariffs too. I can't change other countries' trade policy, right? I can't force them to take, measures to protect their own economies. All I know is, we can control some levers in the United States with the executive authorities we've been given. We've taken care of that. I remember in 2018 going to, business representatives from a large Western European country, and we told them we're going to put tariffs on China to control for unfair trade practices and overcapacity. What are you going to do? And they said, we're going to out-innovate the Chinese. Now, I've met the Chinese, and they're becoming quite innovative. So I don't think that was the great policy. And now here we are, 8 years later. If I were outside the U.S. and I was one of these countries that was facing overcapacity from China or elsewhere, or Vietnam, et cetera, I would think about the type of interest-based measures I could be taking, and that countries have taken for literally hundreds of years.
So you think the EU should put tariffs on China?
Well, I'm not going to say that in a public forum.
Why not? Go ahead.
Well, because I'm just trying to get along with everybody, right? I'm like the good cop here.
This is not what's going to get you to get along with them. Let's talk about the U.S. economy. Well, first of all, there is a Supreme Court decision coming down the line, possibly in...
What time is it? Is it 10 a.m.?
No, in exactly 17 minutes.
It'll be fine. It'll be fine.
That's what you're expecting, that it's going to be fine?
Well, first of all, we don't know if the decision's going to come down.
Yeah.
First of all, we've had the past 2 weeks where everyone went to the court, and Justice Sotomayor came out and she said, why is everyone here? They weren't there for the criminal defense case that they handed down. So the case will come down eventually. The administration gave the court a clear pathway to find in favor of the administration. I won't go into great detail about this, otherwise I won't stop talking about it. The plain language of the statute authorizes the president in an emergency situation to regulate imports. You regulate imports with the tariff. That's just historic. That's how it works. There's an emergency with our trade deficit and offshoring. Courts typically will defer on the emergency. So we think there's a clear statutory and constitutional basis for all of this.
But if it does rule against you, what will you do? Would these tariffs on Greenland work?
Well, so what I would say is, the Trump team has been thinking about these actions for years. And my sense is, had COVID not happened at the end in 2020, you probably would have seen broader action even then. So there are a lot of different options. My general counsel has told me that I'm not allowed to discuss them in public, so sorry. But there are a lot of different plans available. The president chose to use IEEPA because it is the most appropriate to the situations we're facing. For the emergency like the trade deficit, for emergencies related to national security, it's the most appropriate. So if we aren't allowed to use that, there are other tools we can use, certainly, but IEEPA is the most appropriate.
You spoke in your presentation about manufacturing, and we know the president wants to return manufacturing jobs to the U.S. When I last looked, U.S. manufacturing activity has been contracting for several months. What do you think that is?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of factors we look at. There's that one where it's contracting. The manufacturing jobs numbers are, kind of middling. But there are other ones that also indicate that the boom is coming. And I would say that construction jobs have gone up significantly. Manufacturing productivity has shot up over the past year. Manufacturing wages have gone up. So there are some indicators that we don't have the jobs right now, because normally when you're building a factory, it takes some time. You have to get these things going. And so we're seeing We're seeing the construction starts. We're seeing the construction jobs going up. We're seeing productivity going up. So I think that all of that activity is happening right now to get it up and running, and so we'll see more of that in the coming year. We also have the full effect of the tax bill, which allows for expensing for capital goods, R&D, and that kind of thing. So we're watching that, those indicators. They're not where I want them to be yet, but we're confident they'll get there.
The labor market is also cooling. Do you think that tariffs had anything to do with that?
So no, I don't think so. You have to remember in the United States, with our new immigration policy, a lot of folks have left the United States. And so and we cut some government jobs because we didn't want an economy fueled by illegal immigration and government jobs. And so the president, over the past year, there have been 650,000 jobs created, and they're all in the private sector, and they're all to Americans. So that's the kind of healthy job growth we want. We don't want an economy that's fueled by government jobs. So you're going to see that effect in the labor numbers. I think the middle of this year, I think the labor numbers will be a little more reflective of our policies outside of the immigration and government cuts.
I know that you don't think that tariffs drive up prices, but if you look at the polls and you have the midterm elections coming, what they show is that American voters are very concerned about inflation. They're very concerned about affordability.
Talk about it.
Well, talk about it, but also, I mean, how is it that you believe that tariffs had nothing to do with prices?
So if you look at the drivers of inflation, these are all related to services we don't import that are subsidized by government. Healthcare, housing, education. This is where, or energy to some degree, right? So these are areas we don't import these things. That's where the largest impact of inflation is. And if you look at where we were in the Biden administration, I think we hit a high of 9% or something like that. We're now down to 2.7. I mean, that's huge progress. And then when you look at the actual, inflation numbers for goods, there are a few goods here and there where we have seen high prices, right? Beef is one of these. That's related to the size of the U.S. cattle herd, right? It's cyclical, and every 10 years it gets low, and then you build it back up. Things like coffee, like tariffs can't control a weather event in Brazil 18 months ago, which affects, commodity prices and the downstream. So, can tariffs have an effect on price? Of course they can have an effect on price, but it's typically not an inflationary effect, right? You might get that if you have like a single supplier overseas and they have huge market power to raise the price, but most of these people overseas who are selling to the U.S. market want to keep that market share, and so they're competing, and so are all the people along the supply chain before it gets to the consumer to eat a portion of that. And so that's why we're not seeing overall inflation. You may see some price effects here and there for specific items.
So some companies have told me that what they've done is absorb some of the cost of tariffs, and they don't want to immediately raise prices. So what they do is they raise them, little by little, so that you don't notice. Are you seeing that?
So no is the answer. I mean, you can cherry pick. You can go to a certain month and say, inflation went up for goods by 0.3%, but then I can find another one and I say, but durables goods went down by 4%. I mean, when you look at the overall trajectory of inflation, it's in check and going down. And importantly, when we talk about the growth that we're experiencing in the United States, it's not just about the prices, it's about wages. And wages are outpacing inflation, especially for blue-collar workers, especially for manufacturing jobs. When you look at the Biden administration, real wages went down by $3,000 over that administration. We're already up $1,300, and we're only a year in. So we're trying to claw back out of this place where we were found, and the fact that wages are outpacing inflation is a really important part of the calculation when we look at the economic effects of our overall program.
So do you think that the issue of affordability is going to have a big impact in the midterm?
Listen, I think Americans are worried about affordability, and again, it's less focused on goods that we import that we have huge supply. There's oversupply in the world for most goods, but we are concerned about healthcare, where it's subsidized by the government, so it goes up. Education, it's subsidized by the government, so it goes up. Energy, these are often state-run utilities that are poorly run in many cases, so it goes up. So all of these services that are subsidized by the government under schemes largely developed by Democrats, yeah, that's a concern.
We'll take a couple of questions if you're happy, but I wanted to ask you, so prepare them. But do you think that Congress has a role in tariff policy?
Yeah. If you go to Congress today, the members of Congress will start off by saying, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution entrusts tariff policy to the Congress of the United States, and that's true, and that's written down. And Congress, frankly, in its wisdom, has delegated a lot of that authority to the president, whether it's to investigate unfair trade practices, or do anti-dumping and countervailing duties, do national security tariffs, do IEEPA tariffs, do safeguard tariffs. So there are a lot of delegations that give the president broad authority because the president is executive and he can act and he has a team and he has experts. Congress doesn't have those kinds of tools, so that's why over time they've delegated a lot of it.
If there is a question, you can raise your hand. The other thing, go ahead. I was going to turn to something else, but go ahead.
Thank you for your time. So as I understand it, just looking from the outside, President Trump was elected because of his superior ability to manage the economy, to sort of challenge the defense military industrial complex, and then protect the borders. And he doesn't seem to be polling too well with respect to the economy. He doesn't seem to be polling too well with respect to the military industrial complex. And it seems like he's not doing particularly well with respect to ICE, although he did very well in the beginning in terms of controlling the borders. So what do you think needs to happen to improve that over the remainder of his term?
Well, I'm not like the political strategy guy. The reality is the policies that the president is implementing, whether it's domestic policies on immigration, which was a big reason why he was elected, external policies on trade and economics, another reason he was elected, energy policy, where we're pumping more oil than we ever have, and the price of gas is down lower than it's been since 2019. The president's essentially competing with himself now from the first term to have lower gas prices. So part of it is we need to make sure that we follow through on these policies. It's pretty common to have second-term presidents have their polling numbers kind of go like this. And for every poll you can find that says he's doing poorly, I can find one that says, well, at this time in President Obama's presidency, he had very low favorability, or President Bush was lower. So, in any given moment, you can kind of see different things. What I look at is wages are going up. GDP last year was at 3.2%, higher than expected. It's projected for 5.4. And so this idea that if we had not had tariffs, we would have had, 7% growth? I mean, it's the counterfactual is like kind of crazy. So I think the president's going to continue with the policies, including those that resonate most with Americans, especially for some of those issues that matter. The prices of healthcare and energy. I mean, all kinds of things like that. Affordability for housing. I mean, that's what his speech is going to be about here, is about housing affordability. So these are the kinds of things that the president's quite focused on. If he remains focused on them and executes, I think we're going to be fine.
The question down there? Yes.
Hello, I'm a journalist, Alina Trabatoni. I wanted to ask you if you could comment on how the energy dynamics could change in terms of the European-American relationship with these latest developments. Also, given the lots of change, I mean, Europe is very dependent on the US for LNG and all the various developments that have taken place over the last couple of years on that front.
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, I think American energy is the most dependable energy for Europe. I know Europe has their climate goals, which are different than U.S. climate goals, but LNG is something that is a relatively clean fossil fuel compared to others. I think that Europe's continued reliance to some degree on Russian oil is just like I can't, it's so dissonant to me, right? I mean, maybe this is how the Europeans feel when they hear the Trump people talk about things. But when I see the Europeans, coming to wanting to come to the defense of Ukraine, but literally sending money to Russia, I just like I can't even make that make sense in my own head. I mean, obviously, the United States is always going to be a better source for LNG, et cetera. Obviously, we have the Gulf and others. At the same time, Europe has rules in place, rules about methane, CSDDD, all these things that make it look like they're fighting really hard against getting LNG from other countries. So to me, it's a schizophrenic energy policy in Europe. In this instance, I credit the French for leaving those nuclear reactors on. I mean, good on them, right? I mean, I think that we have to use whatever energy makes the most sense for our country. I think that the United States will continue to be a great source for LNG for Europe and the world, and we are happy to work with Europe to find a way to supply them.
Two more, if you're okay with that. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Ray Wong with Constellation Research. So after we reset our tariffs and reset our trade agreements, what are we going to do to create a similar Belt and Road type initiative to bring the carrot back after the stick?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that is going to happen organically. I think, for example, with things like critical supply chains, that is probably the place to start. We've had conversations with many partner countries on critical minerals, for example. We've had quite detailed, memorandas or negotiations exploring, potential trade tools like price floors to make sure that new projects aren't undercut by, dumped critical minerals. We've talked about specific projects in certain countries. Australia, for example, we have a list of projects we're working on with them, and the United States is deploying tools from the Exim Bank or Development Finance Corporation. We're partnering with the private sector to try to get these things up and running. So I think that is more of a, it's more market-based. It's trying to use government tools to push projects that might not be economically viable over the edge to where they are, whether it's by having a price floor or a tariff or a little bit of support from a institutional, government institution, financial institution. Those are the types of things that I think are more fitting for the way America wants to do things and its allies.
Thank you.
Down there, yeah.
Hi, Ambassador Greer. Nice to see you again. Last time you gave a great presentation at the Economic Club of New York last year. And my question today for you is that recently we have seen that Canada and China are re-engaging a very constructive way. And so from a standpoint of U.S. trade policy, does that raise any concerns? Thank you.
Thanks. So when you look at the substance of that agreement, it's a fairly discrete trade, not unlike the kinds of trades other countries might do. A few years ago, Canada put a big tariff on Chinese electric vehicles of 100%. China retaliated, as they're wont to do, by cutting off canola oil going to China. Did you know that the word canola is like a made-up word? They said it's like oil from Canada. It's made from rapeseed oil, and that's like not an attractive kind of word, so they called it Canada oil canola. Anyway, things I've learned in the past week. So that's kind of a national interest type of trade they made. This is why you hear President Trump, when he's asked about it, what do you think? He said, well, it's in their national interest. Of course they're going to do that. I think there's a broader question, less about the substance of the immediate deal and more of, is this really a change in their orientation? The reality is Canada's GDP is 75% dependent on the United States. Canada's geopolitical decisions are not the hinge on which history swings, right? There's still going to be a ton of trade between the U.S. and Canada. We have an agreement. We'll see how that goes. We're in the review period. Our own view is any trade with Canada needs to be in the American interest, and if they enter into agreements or negotiations with other countries that are against our interest, we'll account for that. So far, the content of this particular deal, we're watching it cautiously, but it's a trade they made, and we'll see what happens next.
I think that's it. That's it for. Okay, go ahead.
Had one.
If we can go 1 minute over time.
Thank you very much, Ursula Gatek, Polish Public TV. Ambassador, when you mention the trade deficit you have with Europe, you seem to ignore intangibles. Some statistics suggest that if you take into effect the whole digital economy, you actually have a surplus with the EU. Would you care to comment on that?
Yes, because you fell into my trap. So Europeans always do this. So do you know how the services numbers are calculated? It's like so when you calculate the numbers for goods, there's literally a piece of paper or online documents. How much is it? What's the value, et cetera? These numbers are pretty good in developed economies, so we have a very good and reliable sense of what the goods trade looks like. The services numbers, this is how we do it in America, and my guess is how they do it in other places too. We have an agency, the BEA, and it sends out surveys to every firm in America, right? They send it out, and they say, if you don't answer the survey, we can subpoena you. I have never heard in my entire life of anyone ever being subpoenaed to provide the services data. So first of all, you're getting back what's effectively voluntary data from firms, and half of it's made up. Because when you look at it, it's an unintelligible form. And you don't know how much to account for US or overseas or anything. So the numbers are quite unreliable. Case in point, if you go to the UK and you say, what's your services balance with the United States? They'll say, oh, well, in the UK, we're proud to have a services surplus with the United States. If you go to the United States, they'll say, well, we're proud to have a services surplus with the UK. So those numbers are bunk.
And on that note, great, that's it. Thank you.